Hello everybody. In my last lecture I talked about the oral cavity, that means the mouth and the structures inside the mouth, the boundary of the mouth, and you know that inside the mouth you have the teeth, and teeth digest the food or break down the food by pressure. Mechanical digestion or breakdown mechanically, that means by pressure, by cutting or crashing or chopping, right, or grinding. So those all belong to the mechanical digestion. Teeth form two arches. Upper teeth form the upper arch and the lower teeth form the lower arch. You know that upper teeth are attached to the upper jaw bone, the maxillary bone, and lower teeth are attached to the lower jaw bone, which is the mandible, right? So in adult person there are total 32 permanent teeth. That means in each arch you have 16 permanent teeth. So we'll see what are those 32 permanent teeth, because there are different types of teeth. We'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the structure of a tooth, and then we'll talk about the next organ to your mouth or oral cavity is the pharynx. We'll talk about the parts. There are three parts in the pharynx, so we'll see what are those three parts of the pharynx. Okay, then we'll talk about the process of swallowing of food, that is called deglutition. Okay, how that occurs. Then we'll talk about the next organ or part of the digestive system is the esophagus. So we'll talk about the esophagus, and then we'll talk about the stomach. So first, if you see the structure of a tooth has three parts. The part is exposed, that means the part you see from outside, that's the crown of the tooth. And then there is a part that connects the crown and root. These two parts, this is called the neck. Neck is actually the boundary between the crown and the root, and the neck part is located inside the gum. And then you have the root. This root part of your tooth is located inside the bony socket, that means inside the bones. The bony sockets are called the alveolus. So inside the alveolus the root part is located. So if you see here in this picture, in the left side, you see this part that we can see from outside. The exposed part of your tooth is the crown, right, which looks white because it has the white covering that is called enamel. Okay, and then next part is the middle portion that connects the crown and the root, and this portion is called the neck part of your root. You see, this is the gum, so it is actually in the inside the gum. And then this is the bone, and this is the bony socket, and inside the bony socket this part is called the root part of your tooth. Okay, so crown, neck, and root part is located inside the bony socket. Now those are three parts of a tooth. Now if you cut a tooth and see the structure of it, a tooth has a number of structures. We'll see what are the structures of a tooth. Okay. The upper surface is the occlusal surface, and this outer white covering of your tooth is called the enamel. Okay. And next to the enamel, that means inside the enamel you have the dentin. Okay. And then inside the crown, the innermost part is called the pulp cavity, in which the end of the blood vessels, arteries, veins, as well as the nerve endings are present. So inside the pulp cavity you have the blood vessels and nerves. Okay, the endings of the blood vessels and the nerves. So those are the structures in the crown part. Now if you see the root part, there is no enamel, right? In the root part, enamel only covers the exposed part. However, in the root part you have another structure, a different structure or layer, that is called the cementum. So outer cementum, and then you have the dentin. So dentin is everywhere, right? But enamel is only in the outer part and cementum is only in the root part. And then you have the root canal. You see this narrow passage, this is the root canal through which the blood vessels, arteries, veins and nerves go to the pulp cavity. Okay. And around the cementum, the root part of your tooth has a ligament that is called the periodontal ligament. So this is the periodontal ligament. Okay. And this ligament attaches the tooth to the bone, so the tooth will not easily come off. So ligaments attach, that ligament is called the periodontal ligament, attaches the root to the bony socket. Okay, so those are the parts. So two things here you have learned. Those are the structures. So two things you have learned: parts, three parts, right? And structures in a tooth. Now you have 32 permanent teeth. However, in early life, first you get 20 teeth, and these 20 teeth are not permanent. They are replaced by 32 permanent teeth, and these 20 teeth are called deciduous teeth. Okay, temporary. And the deciduous teeth then are replaced by 32 permanent teeth. So as I mentioned, your 32 teeth are present in two arches, right? Each has 16. So if we see one arch, what are different types of tooth you have? You have incisors. Incisors have the edge, lower edge, which is sharp, blade shaped teeth. Okay, and incisors help to chop the food or cut the food because they work like blade or knife. Canines. Canines are pointed tooth, and canines are pointed teeth, and canines help to tear the flesh or fibrous food. Okay, so you will see in those creatures or animals, they eat raw meat. Their canine teeth are more pointed and longer. In human, we have canines, but the canines are not very long. Premolars. Premolars have flattened crowns with prominent ridges, so they can help crushing, mashing, or grinding the food. Okay, and molars are have very large flattened crowns with prominent ridges. So molars also have similar functions to the premolars, crushing, grinding. Okay, now the molars have more roots. Each molar has 3 roots in the upper jaw and 2 roots in the lower jaw. So these are the 4 different types of teeth in the human subject: incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. So if you see here, you can see the shape of those different types of teeth. Here you see the incisors have sharp blade-like edge, so chopping or cutting of the food, and cuspids are the canine. So if you see the canine teeth, they have pointed end. So tearing the fibrous food is the main function. And bicuspids are premolars, and you see the surface would be more like flat and prominent ridges, and they help to grind or crush the food. And molars, you see molars, upper molars have 3 roots, lower molars 2, and their surface is flat, wide, and help to crush, grind, or break the food. So your teeth help to break the food, which is the digestion, right? So as I mentioned, there are 20 deciduous teeth erupt at age 2 years of age. Okay, and these teeth are also called primary teeth, milk teeth, or baby teeth. Secondary dentition, 3 additional molar teeth appear on each side of the upper and lower jaw, and the third molar is called the wisdom teeth. Okay, so wisdom teeth is the third molar, and total 32 permanent teeth replace the 20 deciduous or baby teeth. Here you see 2 arches. This is the upper and this is the lower arch. So each arch has 16, right? Here these are actually deciduous, so each arch has 10. So you see, if you see 1/2 of the arch should have 5, right? 5, 10, and 10, 10, 20. So these are deciduous teeth. Now if you see the permanent, each arch has 16, right? And if I divide the arch into 2 halves, this is half of an arch. How many you have in each half of the arch? You see, we can start from here. This is one incisor. This is called the central incisor because it's close to the midline, right? And then this incisor is called the lateral incisor. Okay, so these two are incisors. This is central, this is lateral. And then you have one canine. Then these two are premolars. This is first premolar, this is second premolar, right? And three molar. And the third molar is called the wisdom teeth. So total 8, right? So if in one side of the arch, that means half of the arch has two incisors, then the whole arch has how many? 4, right? 2 and 2. So 4, and all together you have 4 incisors in the upper arch and 4 incisors in the lower arch. So total 8. So incisors are total 8. These are central incisor, lateral incisor. Okay, and then you have one canine in each half of the arch. So there are 1, 2 in lower arch. You also have 2. So total 4 canines altogether, right? And each arch, half of an arch, you have 2 premolars. So total 2, 2, 4, and in the lower arch you have 4. So total 8 premolar. And here you have 3 molar, 3 molar, same in the lower arch. So 6 and 6, 12. So total 12 molars. Makes sense? So total, if you add, 32 permanent teeth. Next to the oral cavity or mouth, you have the pharynx, and pharynx has 3 parts. The uppermost part of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx, which is posterior to the nasal cavity. Only air passes through it, right? From the nasal cavity, air enters into nasopharynx and then it goes through oro and laryngopharynx. Then posterior to the oral cavity or mouth, you have the oropharynx. Okay, makes sense. And oropharynx receives the food from the oral cavity or mouth. You know that we take the food through the mouth, so that food will enter into the oropharynx, and from above, from the nasopharynx, the air will also come. So both food from the mouth and air from the nasopharynx, right, enter into the oropharynx. So it is a common passage for both the air and the food. And next is the laryngopharynx. This is also common because food from oro enters into laryngo and air also enters into laryngopharynx. So those are the 3 parts of the pharynx. These 2 are common for food and air, but this one only for air. Food should not enter into it. Okay, now if you see those 3 parts shown by 3 different colors, this is naso, this is oro, and this is laryngo. Okay, so food enters this way and air enters this way. Okay, and then you see from the lower end of laryngopharynx, 2 separate tubes start. Okay, in the front, this tube is called the larynx, and this is the laryngeal inlet, and this tube is the esophagus. So food enters into the esophagus, but air enters into the larynx. Make sense? And they get separated because we know that air should go to the lung, so they should take a different route, and the food bolus should enter into the stomach. So this esophagus will take the food to the stomach, and this larynx will take the air to the lungs. Make sense? Okay. If you see the nasopharynx, two structures I'll mention you need to know are present in the nasopharynx. This structure is called the adenoid or pharyngeal tonsil. Okay, pharyngeal tonsil. Okay, and also called adenoid. And the surgical removal of pharyngeal tonsil is called adenoidectomy. Adenoidectomy. Ectomy means removal. Okay, and sometimes tonsillitis that causes pain and other problems, so removal of the tonsil is a good idea. Okay, and also in the nasopharynx part there is an opening of the auditory tube. This auditory tube actually connects the nasopharynx to the middle ear. So this tube goes to the middle ear, and this is called the auditory tube. In small children or babies, they have short head, right? So the middle ear and the nasopharynx are pretty close to each other, and fluid can easily go from the nose or nasopharynx to the ear, and that's why ear infection is pretty common. If you just see the head of a baby, this is the ear here, right, and the nose is here, and nasopharynx and ear pretty close. As the head grows, the distance increases, right, and fluid cannot easily go to the ear, so ear infection doesn't happen in older people or adult person pretty often, but happens more often in the babies because of the short auditory tube, and which also it is more horizontally placed, so the fluid can easily go from the nose to the ear through the auditory tube. Okay, now this structure is called the epiglottis. When you swallow the food, this epiglottis will move down to cover the inlet of the larynx or laryngeal inlet, so the food will not enter into the larynx. Food will enter into the esophagus, right, to go to the stomach. Even a small amount of food enters into the larynx, you will feel that coughing, and that's a problem. So the laryngeal inlet is covered by the epiglottis, and when you breathe, then the epiglottis will move up to open the laryngeal inlet so the air can enter into the larynx. Okay, so that's the pharynx. It has three parts, and we talked about those three parts of the pharynx. And one thing here, remember, those areas are only for the air. They have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar. They have cilia, right? And those areas are for the food. They have a different epithelial lining because the chance of friction is high, right? Air will not cause much friction, but the food will cause more friction. So those areas, for example, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, are for the food too. So they have a different epithelial lining, that is the stratified squamous. squamous. Okay, but nasopharynx is only for the air, so it is pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Esophagus is a narrow flat muscular tube that transports food from the pharynx to the stomach. So it is a tube, and the food bolus, once it enters into the esophagus, it will very fast pass through it and reach to the stomach, will go to the stomach. Why the food goes pretty fast from the pharynx to the stomach through the esophagus? Because this is the food bolus, this is esophagus, and when the food enters in the upper part of your esophagus, a movement, wave-like movement, that is called peristalsis, starts here, and that pushes the food bolus pretty fast downwards, right? And also the inner surface of the esophagus is slippery because of the mucus secretion. So those two factors, one is peristalsis movement and another is the slippery inner surface, will make the food bolus pass through it very fast, and the food bolus will arrive here. Okay, and the area where the esophagus enters into the stomach is called the lower esophageal sphincter or constriction, and also called the cardia or cardiac region. Okay, where you have the sphincter called the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, since the food passes through it, it is lined by stratified columnar, actually stratified columnar epithelium, not pseudostratified. Upper part of it is formed by the skeletal muscle, and lower part is formed by smooth muscle. So this is the wall of the upper part of the esophagus is skeletal, and lower part has smooth. So this is interesting, and you know, skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle, so you can control in some extent when the food is here, but if the food is here, you have no control. So esophagus has two sphincters. At the upper end you have the upper esophageal, and the lower end you have the lower esophageal sphincter. It is about 10 inches long, 25 centimeter, and then peristalsis is the type of movement, wave-like movement that moves the food very fast. Okay. Now if you see the wall of the esophagus and the layers in it, you have innermost mucosa, then under the mucosa you have the submucosa, and then muscularis externa, and outermost layer is called the adventitia, not serosa, because it is in the thoracic cavity, not in the abdominal cavity. Abdominal cavity has serous layer, serosa. Okay, so these are the four layers in the wall of the esophagus, from inside to outside: mucosa, then submucosa, then muscularis externa, and adventitia. In the small intestine, large intestine, stomach, you have these layers same, but outermost layer is called serosa, not adventitia. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, now we'll talk about the swallowing or deglutition. Once the food stuff gets mixed with the saliva with the help of your tongue, then a nice bolus of food is formed inside the oral cavity or mouth, right? uh, by digestion, both mechanical by the teeth and chemical by the saliva. A nice semi-solid food bolus is formed, and that food bolus is slippery because of the mucin. Now what happens, after the food bolus is formed inside the mouth, then we use the tongue and press the tongue against the hard palate posterior to the food bolus to push the food towards the pharynx. Okay, and once the food bolus enters into the pharynx, then next phase starts. So buccal is the mouth, right? So inside the mouth, what happens, that's the buccal or buccal phase, and this is strictly voluntary. If you decide, you can keep it longer inside the mouth. If you decide, you can push it to the pharynx. Make sense? Oropharynx. So that's why it is strictly voluntary. Depends on your will, and it happens inside the buccal cavity or oral cavity. That's why this is buccal phase. Okay, and you press the food bolus against the hard palate with the tongue, and that would push the food towards the oropharynx. Okay, and then next phase is the pharyngeal phase, because the food is now inside the pharynx, right? And once the food bolus enters into the pharynx, then you don't need to do anything. The motor command from the swallowing center in the medulla oblongata coordinates the muscle contraction in the pharyngeal muscles, coordinate the muscle contractions in the pharyngeal muscles, and that helps the food to pass through the pharynx. Okay, bolus moves through the pharynx into the esophagus, and then next phase is the esophageal phase. Begins as bolus is forced through the entrance to the esophagus. So you remember I showed you the esophagus is a long, flat, narrow tube, and it has two sphincters, upper and lower, and this is the stomach, right? So the upper esophageal sphincter, lower esophageal sphincter. Once the food bolus enters into the esophagus, then upper esophageal sphincter will get constricted. So first it will stay open, let the food bolus get in, and once it is inside the esophagus, the sphincter will constrict to narrow the opening, which is helpful because the food will not be able to go back to the pharynx. Makes sense? Food can only now go downwards, and food will move very fast. And when the food bolus will come here, the lower esophageal sphincter, which was very constricted because of the presence of food, it will get wide open, so the food bolus will be able to enter into the stomach. Okay, and once the food bolus is inside the stomach, a lot of secretion, gastric secretion takes place, and the food bolus gets dissolved in the secretion, and that is the chyme or chyme inside the stomach. So if you see inside the stomach, you'll see fluid. The food stuffs are mixed with the fluid, so it's liquid form of food. Here you see the phases of declutation or swallowing. So this is the buccal phase. So inside the mouth, the food bolus is formed, and you press the tongue against the palate, that will push the food bolus to the pharynx. So that's the buccal or buccal phase. Now the food will pass through the pharynx. Pharynx is the muscular tube, and that is the pharyngeal phase. And your medullary oblongata has the swallowing centers that will control the muscles to move the food through the pharynx. And here the food is already inside the esophagus, right? And by peristalsis type movement, the food will move down very fast, and as upper esophageal sphincter will get very constricted or narrow, so the food will not be able to go back, will move downwards. And then the lower esophageal sphincter, which was very constricted before, but when the food will arrive here, it will open wide to let the food get in to the stomach. So that's the esophageal phase. So only this part is the voluntary. When the food is inside your mouth, you can decide whether you want to swallow it or not. But once the food enters into the pharynx, you don't think that, right? Your task is just pushing the food to the pharynx, and then rest part is taken care of by itself. Okay, so that's the deglutition or swallowing, and its 3 phases. Now we'll see the structures that tie the abdominal organs to the wall and keep them in right positions in the abdominal cavity. Okay, so we'll see those structures. These are called mesentery. You see the mesentery. This is the main mesentery. Starts from the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity, right? And then from that one, branches are formed. These are the secondary mesentery. And you see, I explained in last class that if this is the body cavity, this is the body cavity, you have the stomach, you have the liver, you have the small intestine, large intestine, and what happens, the parietal layer of peritoneum is attached to the body wall and goes inwards to cover the organ and tie them to the wall to keep them in right position. So like this, they will fuse here and then cover again. Okay, and it will come from the wall too. So this is the parietal layer of peritoneum, this is the visceral layer of peritoneum, and in between you have a lot of fluid. That's the peritoneal fluid in the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so here you see the same thing, the peritoneal layer attached to the body wall, that's the parietal, and the one, so this is the parietal, you see, and the one goes inwards, that's the covering the internal organ, visceral peritoneum, and this is the peritoneal cavity. Makes sense? Okay. Now if you see the stomach and the liver, so from the liver, after the liver is covered by the mesentery, then it goes to the other side of the liver and form the omentum. This is called the lesser omentum, the flat connective tissue membrane that connects the liver to the stomach. Then the lesser omentum, this one, then covers the stomach, and this is called the lesser curvature, enters that way and then covers the whole stomach and gets out through the greater curvature and drafts downwards to cover the entire front part of your small intestine, large intestine, those structures or organs. So you see here, this is your liver, this is your stomach, okay, stomach inside the abdominal cavity, this is the abdominal cavity, okay. So parietal peritoneum, parietal layer, they go inwards and forms the mesentery, and then covers the stomach first, covers the liver first, this is the liver, and then goes to the stomach and covers the stomach, and then drafts down from the lesser curvature of the stomach all the way downwards. This end is free, so it's like a tablecloth or bed sheet that drafts down from the tabletop or surface of the table, hanging part, right? So this hanging part is called the greater omentum. Lot of fat accumulates here, that means it is storing the energy or fat. Also because of the fats, the temperature cannot easily get out or get in, so it acts as an insulator, okay. So the organs will stay warm, okay. So this is the liver and the connective tissue membrane that is going from the liver to the stomach. This is called the lesser omentum, and then goes to the other side of the stomach and drafts down, that's the greater omentum, okay. So this is the greater omentum and this is the lesser omentum, okay. Okay, so these are the topics I wanted to talk in this part, digestive system part 2. We'll talk more about the digestive system. It is a pretty large chapter, so we'll continue in next class. Thank you.